In this session, we are going to provide some tips and best practices for teaching Chapter 8 programming. The topics for this session focus on information we found helpful when teaching Chapter 8. We will discuss teaching programming as a non-programmer, gaining hands-on experience, completing all Chapter 8 course resources, creating fun activities for difficult concepts, and finally preparing to take the exams. Let's start with a very common issue for many of our K-12 teachers, and that is you may or may not have experience with programming. So the question comes up, how can you teach programming as a non-programmer? Well, the short answer is it will likely take a little bit of additional preparation on your part. However, the good news is that you don't have to be an expert in the field in order to teach programming fundamentals. To prepare to teach Chapter 8, you'll want to go through all the course materials thoroughly. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. The second thing is keep it simple. And you want to really just limit the scope of this course to the content that's been provided. This isn't a programming course, so you don't really have to go into a lot of great depth or detail. You just really want to give the students a foundation with those materials and really just have fun with it and enjoy the presentation of the content and help the students have a good experience. The third thing is prepare by doing. And this is where you want to put a little bit more time into your preparation, get your hands on and do a little bit of programming, have some fun with it. You want to install a free integrated development environment, which the Microsoft Visual Code Studio is free. It works for JavaScript and it also works for Python, which we cover in the course. And you'll want to go in, get familiar with the integrated development environment, which is very simple, very straightforward. It's actually a really great one to start your students out on. Some of the others can be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more confusing, but this one's very straightforward. Then create a program in HTML. That basically is just content that appears on the screen. Then you're going to want to add a little bit of CSS, which gives you your page style and look. And then you'll add some JavaScript, which allows your web page viewer to interact, and you can create dynamic content and interactions. Later on, we'll talk about a list of simple programs that you can do that with and give you some ideas. The other thing is get some experience with Python. So those are the two things that programming-wise that you want to get familiar with. Your students are most likely to encounter those languages. When studying Chapter 8 resources, you want to make sure that you go through all the videos and demos, read the text lessons. The text lessons are an easy one for people to kind of like skip past, but that's really where it contains a lot of the details. And you want to make sure that you're familiar with each of the concepts and topics and vocabulary presented in those lessons. Also perform all the labs, get familiar with those. That way you'll know how to help your students through those. And then take the section quizzes and try to pass those at 100%. That way you're familiar with all the content. The final thing is you really want to take notes or identify areas that might require additional structural preparation. So if you found that I came across this topic and I'm having a little bit of difficulty with it, then you can spend a little bit of extra prep time on it so that you're prepared to present that to your students. At TestOut, one of our goals is to help students enter the workforce with the knowledge and skills that they need to be successful. An example is section 8.4. We discuss several additional topics that are important to the daily tasks of programming. For example, version control. That's something that every programmer will use on a daily basis as they're committing new code changes and working with a team on that code. However, you might not see those type of topics on an exam. If passing the exam is part of your class objective, you'll want to make sure that your students really know the terminology, understand the fundamental building blocks of programming, and are also able to read pseudocode. As the students perform the labs in the course, they can gain very valuable programming skills that will benefit them regardless of whatever field they decide to go into. Typically, IT jobs require some level of scripting and/or programming. After your students gain some understanding of section 8.3 programming fundamentals and 8.5 web development, you can do some fun learning activities like incorporating game development. The game Flappy Bird is an example of how easy it is to create a game in HTML5 and JavaScript. Your students can have fun as they explore this game and identify the core building blocks of programming that were used to create it. The students don't really have to worry about understanding how every single thing in that works, but if they are interested in a little bit more detail or what every line of code does, they can watch the developer's tutorial that explains how that code works. For the JavaScript game learning activity, let's go download the file for that. We want to go to github.com, code explained repo, and this is a YouTube channel where they go through and explain a lot of different code. They've got some really popular repositories that they make available. We've got Flappy Bird, Tetris, Snake. Those are some fun games. Some other type of applications like to-do lists or weather apps or multiple choice quiz. So let's go ahead and download our Flappy Bird. And so that downloaded. Just real quick, this shows you what's included in the file. So we'll click right here and say download zip file. And that downloaded to our documents directory. You can see that there's an index HTML, the JavaScript, there's a sounds folder, and then there's an images folder. So it's pretty straightforward. There's also a RAR file that includes kind of a blank template where you can go in and you can actually start creating the code from scratch, and it's all set up so that you can go through and really learn how the game was created. So let's go to our downloads folder and extract the zip file. And we'll navigate into that folder, and let's go ahead and launch the game by double-clicking index.html. And here's the game. So you can see, using the cursor keys, that you can attempt to navigate the game. And if you happen to miss like I'm missing, then it'll actually start over. So that's kind of the whole point, is to see how high of a score you can get there. I'm going to go ahead and close that tab, and let's go ahead and take a look at the actual code. So it's a pretty simple game, but it can be a lot of fun. If we open up the index, let's open that up with our Visual Studio Code. And so I've enabled the option to syntax highlight the JavaScript and also Python in Visual Studio Code. It's an add-on that you can click on from the welcome page. And so it really makes it nice and easy to see the different tags. So we've got all of our HTML tags. Here's our HTML canvas tag that specifies the area where the Flappy Bird will run, and then we tell it to load the Flappy Bird JavaScript. So let's look at the Flappy Bird JavaScript, open that with code. And so you can see we've got the code here in JavaScript that, and if we kind of scroll down with all the extra blank lines, this is still less than 100 lines of code to create that game. So it's a good one. It's not too complex, but it contains a lot of good ideas and concepts. The thing that you want to do as part of the activity is have your students identify various core components or the building blocks. Here we have a var where we're defining a CVS variable, and that is getting the canvas element that we saw in the HTML. Here we're assigning a bird variable and specifying, oh, here's the picture of the bird, and here's the background, the pipe coming from the north, pipe coming from the south, and how those are all drawn in to create the game. And so you want your students to start to understand, how do I assign variables? How do I get that all set up? And then how do I create a function? So here's the function, move up. And if we keep going down, another function called draw. And then you can start identifying for loops here and look at the syntax for that and what it's doing. And then we have some nested if statements in here. So that's within the for loop. So those are good to see. How do I do an if statement? And then how do I make a function call? So this just calls draw, and that comes up and calls this function. And that kind of kicks everything off. So you can keep it really simple. Just identify all the components that you were able to see in Chapter 8. And then if your students want to go a little bit further and maybe this really, piques some interest in them, they want to figure out, hey, this would be really cool if I could do some game development of my own or try to recreate this from scratch using that starter template here. So they can go and watch a step-by-step tutorial that they provide on YouTube that explains all the code and what to do and why they're doing it. And it's really a great thing because it reemphasizes a lot of concepts. People have to understand a little bit about how you pull all these components together. How do you load an image? How do you load up the sound? And how does that interact with HTML? So this is a really fun project, and you can see you can take it from there. You could download one of the other repositories. Those could be great homework assignments. And this is a really good in-class activity, so they kind of get introduced to a little project. Object-oriented programming, or OOP, is a great topic for another learning activity. This activity can be done both as a group activity and then as an individual activity. This really helps the students gain an understanding both collectively and as an individual. You can project the slide shown here, or give the students a handout, or do both. Divide the students into groups of up to 4, have them brainstorm the answers, and then have each group share a portion of what they came up with. And this is also an opportunity where you can clarify or validate the answers. Next, another activity is displayed or handed out to each student to work individually on the answers. This really helps solidify an individual's understanding, and then you review those as a class and discuss the answers. This is an example of the slide that you can display or print out and have the students go do the brainstorming and complete the answers. This shows some of the possible answers. There could be lots of right answers, potentially some that don't quite work, and then you can kind of guide the students and direct them and really help them understand what exactly would work for either a class or an object or property or a method. This is an example of a similar activity that you could use for the individual. Another learning activity is to create a simple and rewarding program using HTML and JavaScript. The code allows you to explain how to embed JavaScript into an HTML document to provide interactivity with that web page. The code will prompt the user for input, process it, and then display output on the web page. Let's take a little bit closer look at the code itself. Here we're declaring a variable named str and then calling window.prompt, which displays a dialog on the screen asking the user for their name. That name is then stored in the str variable. Next, we call document.write, which displays that variable along with a header2 tag saying welcome and then whatever their name is. You'll notice that there's 3 strings concatenated together with plus signs. So there's a little bit more that you can kind of discuss how things work. You can talk about the syntax, various things like that. But in general, you can keep it pretty simple. Kind of a side note, your students might wonder, hey, what's that backslash right in front of the closing tag for the H2? And you could explain to them that when you're inside of JavaScript, that really escapes the character so that the code treats it like a literal character and doesn't try to process it. So that's another discussion. But overall, you can just really keep the scope simple. You could simplify the example if you want to, but you don't have to bring up anything that might go beyond their skill set. There are a lot of great resources out on the internet that can give you some really good ideas for simple programs and also provide the code solution to that, so that as part of your learning process, you could go out and you could try a number of these programs. That also helps you get familiar with the logistics of creating a program, running it, working with the integrated development environment. But this is a good resource that has a lot of those. When you reviewed the course materials, one of the steps was to identify topics that may require some additional instruction. Object-oriented programming is a topic that's commonly a little bit more difficult for people to kind of grasp and understand, and you really want to help them identify the terms of object-oriented programming and how that relates to the real world. In this case, we can use the analogy of a house. If we were to build a house, we would first start with a blueprint. Well, that blueprint is the template that we base everything on, which would be like a class. An object is an actual instance of a class. So once you actually built the house from the blueprint, that would be similar to what a class is. And then of course the properties describe the object. And so that could be, hey, what's the color of the house? How many bedrooms are there? And how many bathrooms? Those type of properties describe the house itself. And then of course you have a method, and the method can be something that you can do with the object. For example, open a door, close a window, light a fire in the fireplace. And you could even go from there and expand the analogy. For example, if you were writing code to create a house, it could be a method called add bedrooms, and then you could type in how many bedrooms you wanted to add to the house, or how many bathrooms, and so forth. But an analogy is really a great way to help your students see how they can apply the real world to programming concepts. Lastly, we want to talk a little bit about preparing your students to take the CompTIA ITF Plus exam. So here's a couple of tips that we found helpful. One of the things you want to do is review the objectives in the appendix. And each one of the sections, so for example, 8.2, you'll be able to go in and see what objectives match CompTIA's exam objectives and how we're covering those in that section. So your students will definitely want to be familiar with every single objective if they're going to go take the exam. Definitely take the practice exam. Make sure that you can score 90% or better on that. For the students, they should probably take it at least 3 times. Later on, we'll have some other recommendations on exam prep. But specifically for programming, one of the things you'll want to do is be familiar with pseudocode and be able to read that and know what output is produced from the pseudocode. You'll want to study each topic in detail and make sure you're comfortable with those. Thank you, and we hope you've found these tips and best practices helpful.